Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda.
When President Donald Trump says jump, every Republican asks, how high? But is he weaker than he appears? Trump plays the hegemon, and many are afraid of him, from his party to the media, law firms, and universities. But at one moment, he will be a lame duck, and he is out. I discussed the current state of the GOP and the Democratic Party with Stephen Green, a professor of political science at North Carolina State University. Listen to our conversation.
If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate.
Stephen, the midterm elections take place in the autumn next year. If Elon Musk really establishes his American party and it clears all the procedural hurdles, could it be a problem for the Republican Party or for the Democrats?
I think it is more likely to be a problem for the Republican Party, but I honestly doubt if Elon Musk has the follow-through on this because of the nature of our political system, where we have winner-take-all elections and single-candidate districts. It's very hard for third parties to get a foothold, and that's no different even when Elon Musk is behind your party. And then the truth is, based on how things look now, and again, it's a long way off, Republicans are looking at a difficult election period. The Republican Party is able to get off the ground in a meaningful way. It probably would draw even more from Republicans and make that even tougher for them.
Can something end a party duopoly in the US?
It's really, really hard. To be fair, the last time it happened was on the eve of our Civil War in the 1850s. So it clearly requires something really dramatic. To be fair, the world has changed a lot. There's dramatic things going on. Our party system seems relatively unstable now. But historically, what happens is that the parties just reform in new ways with new coalitions and new groups of voters, moving from one major party to the other. Most famously in the United States of America, in the American South in the late 1960s into the 1970s, a lot of conservative Southerners, most conservative Southerners, moved from being Democrats to being Republicans. I think we're more likely to see what we call a realignment, that kind of shift in which groups of voters support which parties, than to actually see a third party break up the system.
By the way, would breaking up the system somehow desirable for American democracy, or maybe not?
Oh man, could we use some change. But again, I think a desirable change would be to change the rules that we are operating under, which, as much as I love the U.S. Constitution, just do not seem to serve us well here in the 21st century. And changing the rules is really hard and really unlikely. But I think that's what we would need to get the really kind of major change and reform to put American democracy on a healthier course.
So if you would propose a change of the Constitution, what would it be?
I mean, I'm a fan of ranked choice voting. I'm a fan of proportional representation. I'm a fan of parliamentary systems. I like to tell my students that I think it's quite noteworthy that when you look at the influence the United States of America had on creating the constitutions of new democracies after World War II, we did not seek to emulate our system, which has not necessarily worked so well. Presidential systems like we have, which has survived without dictatorship, but when you look throughout the world, especially in Latin America, for example, presidential systems seem to be much more open to authoritarian takeover, to having the leader who is going to start dictating things. And again, we have, I think, safe to say till this point, largely, if not completely avoided that. but it's a risk, it's a threat, I think more so than in a parliamentary system and a multi-party system.
But people may say that proportional system and multi-party system and parliamentary system, it also creates kind of instability. You need to create coalitions, elections, everything that is very unknown to the US. Do you think that Americans would follow it?
No. I mean, that thing is, how do you get there from here, right? There's a book I used to assign to my students called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, about how to try and turn the United States into a multi-party democracy. And as much as the author, Lee Drutman, makes the case for how American politics would be better, the part that remains, I think even he would have to admit, unconvincing is how do we get from here to there? And certainly part of that is culture. The two-party system has been the American political culture for well over 200 years. And even if people recognize the problems that creates, the gridlock, the polarization, the frustration, there's a status quo bias. People are fearful of dramatic change, and that would certainly be dramatic change.
By the way, when you talk to the students about it, how do they usually react? Do they think like, oh, that might be an interesting idea?
I think the students are probably more open to it than your average American, because they are learning about this within the academic context, within the political science context. And I think to some degree, like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I never thought about it that way. And I'll be honest, even myself, right, born and raised in the United States of America, educated in our system here, I got to college and I did not realize that much of the world was multi-party democracies until I got to college and I took courses in political science and I discovered that proportional representation was a thing. And I think to some degree, that's the case with my students too. And that there's like, oh, this is a different way of looking at things. And I'm really frustrated how the system works. And again, if they're only 20 years old and been politically sentient for just a few years, they don't have the same level of commitment to the system as how it's been. And the fear of change, I think, as somebody who's like, well, I'm really frustrated by all these problems, but this is what I've known my whole life.
I think this is a very interesting debate, but let's switch to something that is really happening, not talking about something that probably will never happen in your country or
Not my lifetimes.
Yeah. Former President Barack Obama recently sent a rather blunt message to Democrats. He said his party should toughen up when facing Trump. There's a famous, I can say, political meme, Dems in disarray. Are they in disarray? What is their biggest weakness now?
The truth is, when one party has all the power in the U.S. government, as the Republicans do, the party that is out of power is almost always looked upon negatively, is always seen as in disarray. I think a large part of that, just a structural thing that we're seeing right now. And yes, the Democrats are out of power. And yes, the Democrats don't have a clear leader. And usually the party out of power does not have a clear leader. A situation like we had a few years ago where the Republicans just said, well, Trump is our guy, even after he lost, and we're sticking with him, is pretty unusual. So there's a lot of different voices within the Democratic Party vying for leadership, vying for influence. And you can call that disarray, or you can just call that normal politics of various people trying to take the lead and trying to be the leader, the messenger of a party that is out of power. And to be fair, having a difficult time figuring out what the best methods are going to be, what the best message is going to be to win back power, because it's not obvious. And again, but the reality is, I think this is always the case. And if you look at the party that is frozen out of power in the United States government, I think that's probably going to be what you're going to see throughout history, certainly throughout recent history. And nothing is going to unify the Democrats like running against whoever the Republican nominee is in 2028. And then you will find, hey, look at Democrats not in disarray and surprisingly unified, I strongly suspect.
And it must be also said that the whole system and the whole party system in the US is quite different compared to Europe. For example, we are talking about who can be a leader of Democrats, but on the other hand, There are very few occasions when there is one leader like Trump at this moment for Republicans. Usually, there are few people who can be described as leaders. There is no chairman of the party with a special position and power. So it's a little bit different than when you look at Europe, right?
Yes, that's a great comparison. It's very much different. And I do think that perhaps somewhat of a problem that Democrats are running into is the obvious leaders would be the congressional leaders, Chuck Schumer in the Senate, Hakeem Jeffries in the House, and they are not, neither of them, the most charismatic, media-savvy figures. And when you are the out party, you really kind of want that charismatic, media-savvy figure. Honestly, well, Bernie Sanders is trying to be a leader. He's a little old. He's older than Donald Trump. He's good at it, but, he's clearly not the future of the party. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC for short, is somebody who really has this charisma and really, maybe in theory, could be that kind of unifying leader. But she comes out of clearly the left part of the Democratic Party. So it is much harder for someone like her to be a unifying figure just because there are some meaningful ideological differences. But so you really kind of need the more moderate AOC. And as of now, that person doesn't exist. And maybe it's harder for them to exist. Maybe it's harder for the person who's more moderate, more centrist within the party to develop the same kind of passionate following as a party figure who is able to speak to the ideological desires of many members of the party.
Steve, you mentioned that Democrats are just looking at what kind of message they can use to get the power back. Obama also said that Democrats need to focus on how to deliver for people. But how much should they focus on economic issue and how much on citizens' rights and defending American democracy from Trump's autocratic attempts? Could it be combined?
Yes, you can. But reality is say there's only so much political oxygen to go around. There's only so much bandwidth your average voter has to pay attention to politics. And I would argue the evidence is voters just don't care that much about the democracy stuff, or anybody who does care about the democracy stuff is already firmly in the Democratic camp and not particularly persuadable. Whereas the economic issues, this is where Democrats really have the opportunity to win voters over. I think it's fair to say that a significant portion of Trump's victory in 2024 was related to frustration with inflation, frustration with high prices, and Donald Trump's promises to bring those down. Now, look, the reality is he has not. He has instituted tariffs, which are starting to and definitely going to make things worse. So it's not only is it a historically compelling message. Bill Clinton's campaign back in 1992 famously said, "It's the economy, stupid." And it always is. So it's a classic message. It's one that should unify the Democratic Party. And one of the problems for the Democratic Party has been it's gotten into real trouble with social and cultural issues. What to do about transgender rights in particular, which seems like it should not be driving national politics, but kind of has been, certainly much more, and arguably, than its importance to much of the public. So there really is something to be gained for Democrats, I think, by focusing on the economy more than anything else.
So let's say they will focus on it, they will find the right message, they will be also able to push the message through the very fragmented media environment full of noise and bullshit. And I know it's probably too soon, but do Democrats have a chance to win at least one of the Congress chambers in the next year's midterms?
Let's put it this way. I would think you would have to consider them a pretty strong favorite to win the U.S. House in 2026. If they actually fail to win the House, that's kind of a disaster. For one, the party out of power almost always has a big swing back in their direction. The House has 435 seats, and a typical swing in an election like this is 27 seats. Democrats only need to pick up, I think, 3 or 4. So that's a very low bar to cross. They really should, you'd think, be able to get at least a dozen, something like that. So if Democrats are not able to pick up that majority in the House, that's a very bad sign for them, short term and going forward. The Senate, because again, of the structure is very different and really rewards rural and small states where Republicans do well, is just a much, much tougher lift for Democrats. If Democrats manage to win back the Senate, that would be not a shock, but definitely surprising. It means that everything went right.
By the way, when we have been talking about leaders, and I know it is extremely unusual, but what about Obama? Of course, he cannot run for president, but he is still quite popular, relatively young. He can do a lot of things.
So why not using him?
Man, that's a good question. And I guess it comes with the territory, but we are asked to psychoanalyze these figures. And so, and here I'm going to go kind of by Michelle Obama's comments. And that is, they sacrificed. They sacrificed a lot of their personal lives, presumably, personal happiness and whatnot, to serve the country in the most fundamental way for 8 years. And I have to think on some level, there's a sense of, we have done our time. We have made our sacrifices. And it is time for a new generation to do that. I think if you look at most former presidents, Donald Trump, a very notable exception, they don't get very involved in politics. And again, I suspect because to some degree, it has to be burnout of undertaking certainly one of the hardest jobs, most stressful jobs in the world.
For Trump, it clearly wasn't that stressful.
No. And speaking of Trump, a somewhat related issue. So here in North Carolina, where we are going to have a Senate election next year, and a lot of people thought that Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, who is a graduate of my university, was going to be the Republican Senate candidate. Certainly it was hers for the taking. If she wanted it, it was going to be hers. She would obviously have her father-in-law's full support and endorsement. And she chose not to. And the reality is, being a United States Senator is not necessarily a fun job. You have to really want power or really want to serve the public. Probably some combination of both. And that's not for everybody, whether you're related to Donald Trump or not. So in the end, I think, Laura Trump didn't run because it's just that doesn't sound like fun compared to what she's doing now. And again, I think for any politician, you kind of have to look at that kind of personal balance. That said, by the time you're a senator, by the time you're running for president, you are looking at somebody who is extremely high on levels of desire for power and or public service.
So let's talk about Trump a bit more. From your perspective, if I can ask this, what is the most appealing thing Trump has done so far in his second term? What was the worst?
It's one of those things where you have to just go through. I want to say not one thing in the sense of just systematically undermining rule of law wherever he can. And we're so used to it. It's, the boiling frog, the death by 1,000 cuts. And America is certainly still a democracy. We're resilient and robust. But just every day that we accept that, oh yeah, we will prosecute people for political reasons. We will ignore court orders, but pretend that we're following the court orders. We will deport people who legally can be in this country. We will, undermine free speech by taking away the right to be here of immigrants who say things we don't like. It's just kind of a full-on assault on the foundations of the rule of law in American democracy in just all of these small little ways, so that none of them are oh my God. It's the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that Trump cannot do this, and he tried to do it anyway. It's never that dramatic. It's never I am putting Barack Obama in jail. It's saying, oh, I might want to do this, right? It is just all of these little things that in the aggregate are very harmful and injurious to democracy. My big hope is that they prove to be short-lived and do not become a fundamental feature of American politics.
Now I should probably ask you, what is the most beautiful thing he has done? Otherwise, I will be accused of suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. So anything positive you can say about him?
Here's what I will say. he has accomplished a lot of his goals. I think these goals are bad goals. I think, his goals of rooting wokeness out of universities are misguided. I think his goals of the way he is shrinking the federal government are misguided, but he is accomplishing a lot of these things. And honestly, even in some ways, I think he is not entirely misguided. I think I'm at a university. We have some ways we need to shape up, and where, we had absolutely become too much of a liberal bubble and, too ideologically captured by what he would call woke. That was absolutely a problem. Now, of course, the way to address this is with, a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, right? Are there problems with the inefficiency of various aspects of the U.S. government? Yes, of course. And so I give him credit for, in theory, addressing problems. But in almost every case, it's sort of like, well, I don't like the China that's on sale here. It's not the best stuff. So we're going to unleash the bull in the China shop, which is not the solution, rather than just like, oh, let's kind of systematically figure out what's wrong and how we can improve it. It is frustrating because I do think there are areas where his instincts really are right in certain ways about, this really could be improved. This could be improved. This is wrong. But again, instead of having a remotely thoughtful approach about these things, it's just kind of sledgehammer after sledgehammer.
Stephen, may I ask, anything has changed in your university in the last few months?
Not dramatically. I mean, the big thing is just the budget and the economy of it, right? That we are a research university. We are a science-oriented university that depends tremendously on grants from the federal government to do this science and research. And a lot of that money has dried up. So it's kind of a budgetary nightmare right now. It does mean that classes are not going to get taught that students need. People are not going to get hired to teach classes that students need. It's just going to redound through the whole system to make it less of an education for our students here and harder for them. And that's really unfortunate.
So to wrap it up, Trump, and I think you suggested that Trump clearly has been better prepared for taking over the government than he was in 2017. And he was already able to pass an important piece of legislation, the big, beautiful bill, whatever we think of it. But there are Epstein files, and it seems this scandal is not going away anytime soon. And according to some polls, Trump's numbers are hard to grade. And at one moment, he will be a lame duck, and he is old. So no matter how much he plays hegemon and how much everybody is afraid of him, from his own party to the media, law firms, and universities, is Trump, in fact, much weaker than he appears?
No. I mean, in the sense that right now, within the Republican Party, Donald Trump says jump, and every Republican elected official or wannabe elected official says how high. As long as that's the case, he is very potent. And I said we have this upcoming Senate race here. Tom Tillis is a Republican senator from North Carolina. He was unwilling to go along with the big, beautiful bill. And he recognized that that unwillingness would mark the end of his political career. He finally took a stand. He said, I am not running for re-election and I am opposing this bill. Now, again, this is entirely unprecedented throughout American history. The idea that a United States senator, because of one substantive disagreement with the president of his party, would essentially be unable to keep serving as a senator. That is just completely outside of our experience. And that's power. And again, Tillis was right. If he had tried to run for re-election, he would not have been successful because Donald Trump would have stopped that. So he has tremendous power. I think, again, in many ways, the really important question for our democracy going forward is just how much does this approach to politics, to governing, how much does it become institutionalized within the Republican Party? That we are always going to play the hardest of hardball, that we are going to bend every rule, that we're going to try and push every possible way we can for political advantage, even if it is harmful to democracy. Because obviously that has been Donald Trump's approach. And everybody just goes along with Donald Trump. And it will be very much important to see when we look at all these other Republicans, the hundreds serving in North Carolina state legislature and thousands in state legislatures and executive branches throughout the country, how much of that was just going along because, okay, I really want to be an elected official and I just kind of got to go along with stuff, versus that this is a transformation of democracy, of at least where one of our parties just does not believe in the democratic process in the same way. And that is the ultimate and most important open question. And it is open. Obviously, authoritarians exist, populists exist throughout the world. But to some degree, I do feel like Donald Trump, everybody said, how come other Republicans cannot get away with this really poor behavior? And you bring up Epstein, for example, and how come other Republicans can't say these awful things? And to some degree, Donald Trump really is a political unicorn. Fact that he has been this fundamental feature of American political culture, American business, pop culture, reality TV, going back to literally the 1980s, I think has allowed him to create a cult of personality around his leadership that has not existed with any other American leader, and which I hope will be very difficult to replicate for any future American leader.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.